the U.S. Expansion Series, the podcast where you can learn about successfully expanding to and scaling your business in the U.S. markets. My name is Fleur. My name is Flora, and in every episode, we dive into a different aspect of a successful market expansion. Flora, how are you today? I'm doing well, thanks. Happy to be here. For this episode, you spoke to London based lawyer Daniel Glazer, and you two discussed how a European company should set up and scale in the US. How did your conversation go? It was a great conversation. He has so much experience assisting companies with their US expansion. And we've been working with him for over 2 years now, and it's been a great pleasure to collaborate with him. For this episode, he shares a lot of information from how to set up a local entity, using agents to get the first boots on the ground in the US, and eventually raising funds from US investors. Wow, that's a lot of valuable information. I guess be prepared to take notes for the listeners. Well, without further ado, let's dive in. Yeah, thanks so much for joining our podcast today. We're so excited to do this podcast with you, especially since you have so much experience assisting European companies that expand to the US. But before we dive into all of this, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about what you do?
Sure thing. Thanks a lot for having me today. So my name is Dan Glazer. I'm the London office managing partner of the Silicon Valley-headquartered law firm, Wilson Sonsini. A little bit about Wilson. So we were the first law firm in Silicon Valley to work with tech companies back in the early 1960s when the first venture funds were formed to invest in tech companies. And our model is sort of to work with garage stage startups, as it were, and scale with them up to IPO and then beyond as a public company. Probably our best known example is we worked to incorporate Google as a company for Larry and Sergey back in the late 1990s. We then worked with them when they went public in 2004, and we still work with them today. So currently we're about 1,100 lawyers, Silicon Valley headquartered, with 13 offices around the United States. All we do is focus on working with technology and life science companies. So I head up our London office and our US expansion team. And our London office is a team of about 30 US and dual qualified UK US corporate tech lawyers that work with European startups through their US life cycle, launch, scale, raise venture capital, and then exit through M&A or IPO in the United States. Everything from, let's say, accelerator stage team that goes to San Francisco to raise a seed round, all the way up to companies that think about listing on the New York Stock Exchange or the next. But the most common point we start to engage, and what I'm sure we'll talk more about today, is when a company comes to us with one of two questions. We're looking to launch in the US, what do we do next? Or we are looking to raise money in the US, what do we do next?
Because we receive the question often, like, of course, for most European startups, the US is a very attractive market with a lot of potential. And we have a lot of conversations with companies that are interested in the US, and they often ask us, when is it the right time to expand to the US? When is our company ready for it? So yeah, do you have any general advice for companies that are interested in the US?
Sure. I mean, we find that the companies that are the most successful coming out of Europe, going to the United States, are the ones that go early or the ones that go late. And here's what I mean by that. Going early is when, let's say you've got a founding team in Europe and they look at the US market and say, you know what, that's really going to be our big market. That's the market that we're going to design a product offering for in the first place. And so they will often move management, let's say the founding team, to the United States and keep engineering and development, other back office functions back in Europe. But they will build out the company specifically to tackle the US market from fairly early in the company's life cycle. They then will raise money from US investors as if they were a homegrown US startup, because in some ways they are a homegrown US startup. No, and they will scale as a US-led European business. Right? That's what I mean by goal. Now, that was, I think, a lot more common, let's say 7-10 years ago, when there wasn't as robust of a venture capital ecosystem in Europe. And we still do see some companies follow that model. But it used to be, let's say, more prevalent because you saw founding teams come out of Europe, let's say, unable to raise early stage capital. That's a lot less likely now. And so going late we see as the much more common model. And by go late I mean the following. Company starts in Europe and initially designs its product offering for its home market, and then raises, let's say, a seed round and maybe even an A round from local or maybe pan-European venture capital investors. And then eventually it gets pulled into the US by customer traction or user growth, right? Like it's a B2B SaaS business that starts to get more and more US customers, and more and more portion of its ARR, greater portion of its ARR is coming out of the United States. It's a B2C company that starts to see significant user uptake, customer uptake from the United States. And eventually they look at the US market and say, there's real product market fit there, or we are close to product market fit there. So what they'll typically do is either, let's say, hire part-time contractors at first, but then eventually hire employees, and maybe even send some people over from HQ to help scale up the business in the States, knowing that they've got product market fit or close to it. In other words, they've de-risked market entry by that initial customer traction and user growth, selling in remotely from Europe. And then they'll build from there as a transatlantic business and maybe raise their next round from US-based investors. It's that going in the middle that ends up being a little bit tricky, right? But it's tempting, right? I mean, the US is a massive commercial market. It has plentiful venture capital. It seems like everybody's willing to buy tech there. And so, sometimes we'll see companies that get started in Europe, but before they've built a strong enough foundation in Europe, before they've built sufficient product market fit, then they try to also go at the US simultaneously. And trying to build on both sides of the Atlantic at the same time without having product market fit in both is very, very difficult, right? It's
because then it's difficult to focus if you go in the middle.
First thing, it's expensive, right? Because and it's expensive in terms of money, it's expensive in terms of time, right? You're still trying to build a foundation in your home market, yet now you're let's say hiring people in the US who generally have higher salaries than in Europe. You're sort of taking your eye off the ball to some extent from your home market while devoting time and energy and money to the United States, which is a very demanding market to get right. And that's fine if you've built a foundation in Europe, you've got people in Europe who can mind the store, as it were, while others focus on the US. But if you haven't built that foundation and found that product market fit in Europe, and at the same time you're going into what's arguably the most competitive market in the world, that's hard.
Yeah. And then if you're in that early phase, you're interested in a market, you want to see if you have product market fit there, if you have traction there, you're first going to sell remotely. But I can imagine that it's then a great way to work with agents so that you sell that boots on the ground without having to set up a real presence or subsidiary there. We'll talk about that later, but that of course has a whole different level of requirements. But how easy is it for European companies to work with US agents? Are there any legal risks there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very common middle ground, let's say middle step between only selling in remotely from a purely European-based business with no one on the ground in the US. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand is setting up a proper US subsidiary, hiring employees out of that subsidiary, and having a proper US business. In between, and again, this is a very common intermediate step, is to hire contractors, sales agents, consultants, but ultimately, non-employee contractors who, in a matter of speaking, can fly the flag for your European business, with sort of a light touch structure. In other words, you can generally hire those individuals out of a European parent company without creating a US subsidiary. right? So it's sort of a structure light approach to going to market in the US. You have individuals who are sort of your people on the ground in the United States, but without the sort of corporate structure, the benefits packages, all the rest that would be associated with setting up a proper, employment structure with a subsidiary in the US. That's a great model. And as I said, it's a very common intermediate step. I would say the biggest risk in the United States to doing this is sort of what I sort of have the following analogy, right? If it looks like a dog and it quacks like a dog, it's a dog in the United States, even if you contractually stipulate that it's a goose, right? Here's what I mean by that, is that just because you have a signed written contract with someone saying that they are a contractor does not mean that they will be deemed to be a contractor under the laws of the relevant state, right? Because whether someone is an employee or not in the US is not dictated, not determined by whether or not they have a formal employment contract in place, right? Like, for example, if you called me up tomorrow when I was sitting in the US and you said, I want you to work for me. And I said, sure. And then I started working for you the next day, I'm going to be deemed to be an employee.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so what I mean by like, it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck, is that if you bring someone in and you have this nice written contract saying that they're a contractor, but they're your, VP of sales, North America, and they work 40 to 50 hours a week, and everything else about them looks like an employee, but they have this nice contract agreement. The chances are that they're probably going to be deemed to be an employee, right? But it's interesting because this is a state by state issue. Remember, the United States, the reason they call it the United States is that it's 50 different states. It says it on the tin, United States. And yes, it's a single country, but it also has 50 different legal tax systems. And for example, while it may be relatively straightforward to hire contractors in New York, in California, it's much more likely that your contractors are going to be deemed to be, in fact, employees. So not only do you have to be careful about this point in general when hiring contractors, but you really need to be careful about it specifically, on a state-by-state basis. What are the rules? Now, we certainly work with enough high-growth startups to know that, yeah, it's easy to say, yes, this is a risk and that's a risk, and you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Yeah, certainly when you are building a high-growth, fast-moving company, sometimes you have to cut corners. Not that you should, but it's understandable, right? This is not, however, a corner that is a good one to cut, right? Because what can happen is that eventually, when you end up, let's say, terminating that relationship as the company, with your contractor on the ground in the US, if you're not careful, that can turn into a dispute where the individual claims that they were actually an employee, not a contractor, right? And then and then make certain threats as a terminated employee against the company, and that's going to have to be handled. So the best approach is to just avoid this issue in the first place and make sure that if you're hiring contractors, they're properly contractors. And if it's instead, if they're really intended to be employees, well, setting up a structure, subsidiary, and everything that goes around it is not that difficult.
Once you're ready to have a physical presence, what are the legal considerations for setting up in the US?
Sure. Over time, there really has been developed sort of best practice for that point in a European company's life cycle where it says, right, I'm going to hire my first US employee. What do we do next? Right. So I'll give you the sort of standard operating model of what that typically looks like. So more often than not, the company is going to the European parent company is going to set up a Delaware incorporated, wholly owned subsidiary of the European parent company. Let me break that down. So why Delaware? As a headline, Delaware reduces friction. I can go deeper than that, but that really is the headline, right? Delaware reduces friction. Long ago, Delaware established itself as the sort of state of choice for incorporation in the United States. It has a very clear set of corporate governance rules. it's relatively inexpensive. It's certainly efficient to set up in Delaware. It actually doesn't really have anything to do with tax, which is sort of a common, I think, misnomer, outside of the U.S. No, it's not really tax at all. It has very predictable, very good corporate governance laws, and it reduces friction when you're going to market in the United States. In fact, when we can talk about this later, if you're thinking about creating a parent company in the United States or incorporating in the United States, let's say without a European parent company, keep in mind that the entire venture capital ecosystem in the United States is built on a foundation of investment in Delaware Corporation. It doesn't mean that U.S. investors won't invest in something other than a Delaware corporation. It's just that the earlier stage you are, the more that they will prefer to invest in a Delaware corporation. But that's sort of a different point, right? If you're going to market as a European parent company, simply hiring in the U.S., you're pretty much every time going to want to think about incorporating in Delaware, and it's always going to be a subsidiary generally, unless you are sort of currently raising money from U.S. investors and they insist on investing into a U.S. parent company. The easiest way to think of it is this. The decision to create a Delaware subsidiary is a commercial and operational decision. The decision to create a Delaware parent company is solely an investor-driven decision. In other words, unless U.S. investor demands or requirements end up playing into the consideration, if you're going to market in the U.S. and you already have a European parent company, to the extent that you need a U.S. company to do whatever it is that you want to do, that can typically be accomplished through a Delaware subsidiary. Now, the one thing that I've been staying away from, because I wanted to talk about in a little more detail, is what form of entity should that subsidiary take, right? And the two most common choices are a Delaware corporation, otherwise known as an Inc., or a Delaware limited liability company, commonly referred to as an LLC. And I'll tell you, now that one, the answer really is determined by tax, although it actually tends to be the tax rules of the home market of the parent company's home market tax rules. So you could say the big difference here between a corporation and an LLC for purposes of creating a subsidiary of a European parent company is that a corporation is a taxable entity. In other words, the corporation is itself taxed for its activities, whereas an LLC by default is a tax pass-through entity. And depending on the home market tax rules of the parent company, right? A corporation, the taxable entity, or the LLC, a tax pass-through entity, may be preferable. And you just need to determine which is preferable under the tax rules of the local jurisdiction. I will tell you, broadly speaking, most of the time, the feedback that we get from tax advisors in the different European countries tends to be corporation rather than LLC. However, sometimes it is LLC. So that's one that we usually recommend to companies, that they just confirm with their home market tax advisors that corporation is the right answer before we go ahead and do that. Because from a legal standpoint, either one's fine. This truly is a tax point, right? So, all right, so now we have let's assume for the sake of this discussion, we have a Delaware corporation subsidiary. What do we do next? All right, so you've got your Delaware corporation subsidiary.
Yeah.
And let's say, for the sake of argument, that you're going to hire your first employees in the state of New York.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so you're going to then register to do business as a foreign Delaware corporation operating in the state of New York, right, with the Secretary of State's office of New York.
Yeah.
And you are going to give your New York employees 2 employment documents, right? A New York state specific IP assignment and confidentiality agreement, which does what it says on the tin, as they say, right? And a New York state specific offer letter, which has the economics and the financials of the arrangement. And every time that you go to a new state, you're going to engage in those same activities over again. So let's say that your next state is California. You're going to then, when you hire in California, you're going to register your Delaware corporation as an entity doing business in California, and you are going to provide the employees in California with California state-specific employment documents. Very important. Do not simply cross out New York and write California in your employment documents. Because again, I go back to what I said a few minutes ago, each state has its own unique employment rules. So now you've set up in let's say, New York with your first employees there. Let's say that you want to provide options to them, right? You want to provide up. And so a couple of things about that, right? First of all, it is generally always going to come out of the parent company, right? Not out of the sub, because the value of the enterprise is in the parent company, right? And if you're an employee in the United States, you are going to want the equity in where the value of the company lies, which is in the parent. In the sub, depending how things work out with the sub, you may end up trying to take money out of the sub, put it into the parent, and if you're getting equity in that entity, that might not be a great outcome as a as an employee. Most importantly, when you're providing options to U.S. employees, and the specific structure of how you do this is going to differ depending on what your home market entity is, right? Whether it's a German GmbH or UK Limited, et cetera. But what will generally always be true is that you're going to need to get a specific U.S. Internal Revenue Service compliant valuation, right? In order to do that. That you should not assume that your home market valuation in Europe is going to meet the test and the standards for the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, for the tax authorities. So you're going to get what's called a 409A valuation, right? And that's going to be tied to the fair market value of the enterprise. And that will allow you to provide potentially tax advantage equity or options to U.S. employees and stay away from potential tax penalties down the road.
And do you see, if you want to be able to find and attract great talent in the US, it's necessary to offer options?
Yeah, generally speaking, yes, in the respect that American employees of startups are typically, compared to European employees, a little bit more focused on the potential upside associated with options. I think part of that stems from the fact that the U.S. venture-backed tech ecosystem has been going since the 1960s, and there have been many examples of employees of startups that have ended up having significant outcomes from sizable M&A or IPO exits. And it's part of the motivation of many American employees in joining a startup is that potential upside. So American employees, on average, will tend to be a little bit more focused on what does my option package look like? Who are the company's VCs, right? And are they VC investors who are likely to have a track record of helping take their portfolio companies to big exits, right? Like in other words, think of American employees, at least many American employees in this regard, as looking at your business almost in the same way that a VC will look at your business, because they are, in some respects, acting in a manner that is analogous to a potential VC, right? They are betting with their time spent being employed by the company, and they're doing it in part, much like your VC is investing their money in part for the big exit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you do want to, in America, in a way that you might not see it as much in Europe, you are going to want to present yourself in a manner that shows a potential big outcome to your employees.
Yeah.
To sort of cover off on the legal side of setup, those are the three main areas, right? Incorporation of the subsidiary, employment documents, and then options, employee equity. There's a few other areas to think about when you go to the US. There's extending your patents and trademarks from your home market to the United States to the extent that's relevant. There's Americanizing your terms and conditions or other contracts for the American market. And then finally, there's data privacy, right? The US does isn't bound by GDPR. It has its own data privacy rules. But if applicable, you're going to want to make sure that you comply with those as well. So it would be tax accounting, banking, business insurance, and payroll methods. And it's very common in the United States to work with, let's say, what's called a professional employer organization, or PEO, once you have the subsidiary. And a PEO co-employs employees together with the subsidiary, which allows the subsidiary to leverage the PEO's retirement benefits plan, health insurance plan, and payroll system so as to leverage the economies of scale and get a better deal on that, rather than go to market with a small handful of employees, and allows them to sort of, outsource it so as to not reinvent. And from a cost standpoint, by far the greatest cost is people.
Yeah.
Right? Salaries in the US tend to be higher, especially in the larger cities in America. They tend to be much higher than the equivalent salaries in Europe, and payroll and benefits tends to be materially higher than in Europe, because we have typically employer-provided healthcare in the United States as standard.
Yeah, we often, when we have conversations with new companies that are thinking of the US market, we have to prepare them already a little bit for the salaries, the healthcare, and the costs associated with it. It's always fair.
But that's why we often say, I mean, the US is sort of an ROI play. Right?
Yeah.
It's a return on investment play. And it's why it's so important to make sure that you're being, as I mentioned before, pulled into the US by customer traction and user growth.
Yeah, and that you're really ready to go to the US market, that you can do the investment. Yeah.
That if you're going to go after the US, it will generally be more expensive than your home market if you're a European-based company. However, the upside is potentially massive if you get it right.
Yeah.
Right. And we certainly talk to plenty of European companies that are, I think, a little bit concerned about the price. And they should definitely be thoughtful about the cost of going to the US. But if you can make, if you're head of sales in New York, who might cost a couple $100,000 or more, is going to make you several million or more, maybe that investment makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. But you don't necessarily want to invest in that individual unless you've got some confidence that you've got sufficient product market fit that individual is going to be able to sell successfully.
Yeah, exactly. And you already said a little bit about US VCs and the Delaware flip. So if you have the subsidiary and you want to raise funds in the US, can you tell us a little bit more about what US investors typically look for in European companies?
Sure. And I think it really kind of depends on stage of the business. I mean, and as a rule of thumb, what I always highlight is, seed tends to be local.
Yeah.
Series A tends to be national or perhaps regional if you're in Europe, and B and beyond is global. And I always say, don't get too caught up in the specific names of the rounds. It's rather a seed. It's rather more of a profile, right? A seed profile round, right? Whether it's technically an A or technically a seed or a pre-seed or whatever, tends to end up being more often than not local. A Series A profile round, again, whether it's called a seed or a B or an A, tends to be more national, regional, and a profile of a B and beyond company tends to be global. And what that leads to is that more often than not, for an early stage European company to raise a round from US-based VCs, you typically need to have a pretty strong US story. Now, let me break down what I mean by that. So we're talking about the same terms, right? When I talk about US VCs here, what I mean are US-based VC funds that are investing out of the United States and do not have individuals on the ground in Europe, right? So, for example, I'm based in London. There are, I think, roughly 36 or so funds that are US-based funds that have set up in London or outside of London over the past few years. They are there in part to make it easier for those funds to invest in earlier stage European companies, right? So when I talk about, what the profile of the company needs to be to raise from US VCs, I don't mean those funds, because those funds are local essentially and are able to invest almost in a stage agnostic way to the extent that they have a stage agnostic investment thesis, right? That they can invest regardless of geography in Europe. the same way they do if they were sort of homegrown European funds. But what I mean is that if you've got US-based funds without anyone on the ground in Europe, and you've got European, let's say, seed stage or even Series A stage businesses that have nobody on the ground in the US, well, then it gets a little bit tricky. I mean, you really do need to have a strong US story. And we usually break that down into there's usually 4 types of European companies at seed or Series A that end up getting funded by US-based VCs as a lead investor, participating with let's say a US VC participating in a round with a European lead is a little bit easier. They don't have to take the board seat. They don't have to they don't have to set the terms. They can rely on the local European-based lead investor to drive the deal. But if you're talking about bringing in a US VC to lead the deal at seed or Series A into a European company, usually there's one of 4 dynamics at play. Right. The first is, let's say that they have management on the ground in the US, right? Okay. There's no sort of bright line as to what that means. Like, sure, if you've got the CEO on the ground in the US, that's probably the clearest one. But like, you know, head of sales, is that good enough? Well, it really kind of comes down to this: can the US VC or the fund, you know, is that individual senior enough so that the VC fund working with that individual can really kind of move the needle, as it were, to help build the US business, right? The second is going to be, what is the company's traction in the United States, right? In other words, let's say it's a B2B SaaS company that's got 3 million in ARR, right? A company that in that 3 million in ARR that's got 2.5 of it coming from US customers, right? And with 150% year-on-year growth is going to look very different to a US VC than a European company that's got 3 million ARR with maybe, you know, 50,000 of it coming from the United States with 40% year-on-year growth, right? Yeah. Again, it goes to how strong the US story is. Yeah. The third, I would say the third dynamic that might lead to US investment is, you know, what experience does the management team have building a US business or raising from US investors previously? I mean, we've certainly seen highly experienced European founders who have raised from US investors in their prior business be able to attract relatively early stage US funding because, frankly, they present themselves as being a good bet, right, to US investors who have seen those individuals succeed before, right? And especially at the early stage of investment, a lot of it really is about the quality of the team, not necessarily so much the metrics, right? And then the fourth dynamic is simply, have you truly built the better mousetrap, right? In other words, is your startup truly, you know, spinning straw into gold? And what I mean by that is that, look, if there really isn't any US angle at all, certainly every once in a while we see a startup come out of Europe, even at the early stage, that is truly doing something completely revolutionary, 10x better than any US company is doing. You know what? That's pretty interesting as well. But I would say the vast majority of the time, when you see a US-based VC lead a seed or Series A round into a European company, one of those 4 dynamics is typically at
Yeah. So yeah, we're running out of time almost. I feel like we could go on for hours. I have one last question. I'm personally always very fascinated by culture, and you are, of course, an American who's living in London. You're working with European, UK, US startups. Are there any common cultural differences that you notice when Europeans are doing business in the US?
So I think what I'll highlight is one of the unique aspects of the United States, right? And then I think that is the sort of the size and the scale of kind of everything, but especially of potential outcomes in a venture-backed tech ecosystem. So I'll give you an anecdote that sort of illustrates what I mean by that. So a number of years ago, I was with a group of European companies in the Bay Area, and there was a fund in the Bay Area that gave a talk about Silicon Valley venture economics. And the VC said something along the lines of the following. It said, listen, we, like pretty much every fund in Silicon Valley, is looking to invest in companies that can return the fund. Not that will return the fund. Obviously, we can't expect them to guarantee that for us, but at least have a credible pathway to return the fund or more if everything breaks right. And if there is no possible credible pathway for the company to return the fund or more, then the opportunity cost of investing into the company is too great, even though there might be a relatively high likelihood of a smaller outcome. Because we are looking as a Silicon Valley fund for fund returning opportunities, right? We need to see that credible pathway to returning the fund. And he said, think about how that actually plays out in practice. The VC said, so we take typically 10% when we invest, and we have roughly $300 million. He said that means that we need to invest in companies that have a credible pathway to showing a $3 billion exit. Right. Yeah. And I remember the group of European companies I was with, there was like an audible gasp in the room, right? But that's the way that a lot of certainly traditional Silicon Valley style American investors are viewing the world, right? Is that they are willing to bet on the massive potential upside, even though the risk of, let's say, losing the company zeroing out may be high as well. And I don't think historically you haven't seen quite that same high risk, high reward dynamic in Europe, for better or for worse. To be clear, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. But I do think that some European companies that we speak with are surprised that a lot of Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley style US investors will readily pass on what seems to be a relatively certain but smaller outcome for the possibility of the massive outcome.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Dan. This is very helpful. I think it will be very helpful for a lot of companies that are interested in doing.
That was your conversation with Dan. Go early or go late? That is the question.
Exactly. And Dan describes so well that the biggest chance for success is when a company gets pulled into the US by customer demand. And we've seen many companies over the years that didn't have the time and resources yet to fully focus on the US market. So I guess in Dan's category, these companies would indeed fall into the middle. It's very interesting.
Also, regarding the ESOPs, which we should dedicate a separate episode to, but especially for SaaS and tech companies, it's important to offer options when you want to attract great talent. And I didn't realize that employees in startups in the US are even more focused on having a stake in the company. But I guess it makes a lot of sense.
But if you're a European company looking to either launch and scale in the US or raise funds in the US, you should reach out to Daniel Glazer at Wilson Sonsini.
Well, thank you, Flora. And thanks to all the listeners. Please subscribe, like, and share. You can find the US Expansion series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.